So basically, what this judgment does is it formalizes a compact we've had in India. You know, in India, we've never really cared about uh, the LGBT community as such. It's never been an issue with us. With transgenders, for example, it was we always accepted gender fluidity for a very long time in history, and the invasions never changed that. What really changed the status of transgenders in India was uh, British norms and things like that. Similarly, if you look at it with homophobia in this country, you can certainly say there was some level of systemic homophobia, in the sense that if guys would walk around, or people knew that two guys were cohabiting, there'd be a lot of sniggering, laughing, and so on and so forth. But actual homophobia is virtually non-existent. In a lot of countries that had laws against this, laws were actively enforced. In Iran, for example, they used to go after homosexuals every 5-6 years and hang them from cranes in public squares. We have never done things like that. So in practice, even though you had a law on the books, we've never really been a homophobic society. So what has the Supreme Court done? The Supreme Court never actually stood up for the rights of individual citizens ever in its existence. It's a very socially conservative organization that just validates the social consensus of the time. And what happened was, in India, tolerance of the LGBTQ community has always been the social norm. All you've seen is that there's been an increased media discourse about it of now, and a highlighting of some of the issues that the community has been facing. So what has the Supreme Court done? It simply formalized something that has always existed in India. Nothing more, nothing less. I think to see it as any kind of heroism or swimming against a tide is a bit excessive. That said, what it does very importantly now is it clarifies the ups and downs, because there's no further appeal against this. This is a review petition. It gives a finality to the fact that the decriminalization of homosexuality can no longer be challenged, unless, of course, it comes up as some kind of a legislative move on part of Parliament. That is when it can now be reversed. The issue is, you'll hear a lot of stories about how this will end persecution. Now, sadly, persecution would have legally ended when you had the case earlier this year or last year about privacy. So, unless you can actually prove your case, it is impossible to prove the carnal intercourse against the order of nature. So, in practical terms, it would mean little. It won't actually remove the kind of scorn that the LGBT community, the fun that is poked at it, the derision that it faces. The second thing is, it also won't remove the day-to-day persecution of people that are LGBTQ. They are not persecuted because they are LGBTQ, but because you have a police force that's badly trained and with very little accountability. They are persecuted, and being LGBTQ was just one more thing to persecute them about. That one part of it will end, but will actual persecution end? Of course not. That is very much a social legal framework that has to be dealt with human capacity building and things like that. So is it landmark? I'm not inclined to think it's particularly landmark in any sense. It's just formalized an existing social norm, and it's made very little impact on the day-to-day persecution that people will actually face, if at all that. Of course it's manufactured. Look at me. I work in defense and security. I've never faced homophobia in my life. I mean, really, what am I, from Mars? We live on the same planet. We live in the same country. We live in the same city. What homophobia is this that people are talking about? I mean, seriously, what? I would really like to know this. Perhaps they come from a lesser educated segment of society, or a somewhat more regressive element of society that they face it. But certainly in professional circles in Delhi, you don't face it. So I would honestly like to see the statistics on this, because all I've seen is two reports, wishy-washy reports. And if you take the methodology of those reports to be accurate, the same methodology gets used by Christian fundamentalists to claim that homosexuals are also pedophiles, are more likely to be pedophiles. So, you can't have both. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Either you use the same methodology that's used to prove that homosexuals are discriminated against in India is also the same methodology that is used to prove that homosexuals are more likely to be pedophiles. So I'm sorry, I don't buy this argument at all. It's largely, like most victimhood narratives in this country, it is largely manufactured. The people who do in fact face extreme persecution and are denied rights are the transgendered people. And there, I think in that particular context, this is one more step in their fight for rights. Not so much for homosexuals, but for transgenders, definitely. I'm not too sure if it's against Hinduism as much because I'm still reading the judgment, but I'm very curious about this word the Supreme Court has used, that majoritarianism, majoritarian tyranny. Complete nonsense. What has the Supreme Court done? Were there demonstrations against the Supreme Court for legalizing it? Did the judges get lynched? Were there fatwas against the judges for legalizing homosexuality? What majoritarian tendency have they gone up against? They have just formalized a compact that has existed in the country. They want to portray themselves as these great heroes for individual human rights and all of that, which they've never been. The Supreme Court has never stood up for the average Indian. They've always been a tool of the state that has perpetuated what the state tells them to do. This is what happened during the emergency also. Don't forget, the Supreme Court validated the emergency. So this is not a case of any great heroism. They have come last to the party after even the government. Now, if you assume this government is full of, cow-loving, Muslim-bashing, homophobic bigots, the government simply saying that it will not oppose the decision is one of the biggest progressive moves since Lyndon Johnson ended segregation in America against his own constituency. So in that respect, if you look at it, the movement of the Supreme Court on this issue has been the least. So there is nothing heroic about any of these judges, so let's not convey any halo of greatness on them. And let's be very, very clear that this judgment is just one small fractional thing. Does it count? Of course, every little bit counts. But keep it in perspective.